Hi, my name is Sangita Kumar, and I'm the CEO and founder of Be the Change Consulting. Join me in Liberated AF, the workplace revolution. This is a podcast where we get to explore what does it take to become the organization that we want to work for. So what is that? The organization I want to work for, it supports my humanity and makes me feel like I belong. It's a place that isn't racist, it isn't extractive. It works for the boomers and the Gen Alphas. There's space for everyone to bring their genius to work. Don't we want to become that? And don't we want to create that? So I have been studying organizational dynamics for over 20 years, and I love working with teams stuck in an entrenched challenge to bring clarity to diverse perspectives and look for ways that human-centered systems. We're going to tell stories, we're going to answer questions, we're going to offer strategies on this podcast. Together, we are going to become something new. Let's go.
Happy 2026, Sangita.
Happy 2026, Fong. We made it. We made it through 2025. It was a crazy year.
It was a crazy year, and I feel like some of that energy is going into 2026.
Yeah. Sadly, it's we continue in the struggles in the federal climate, at least. And
Yeah.
I'm seeing, I think, like, maybe it's my toxic optimism, but I'm also seeing so much this kind of community coming back together.
Mhm.
People doing, I had a friend who came over for dinner last night, and she was like, yeah, I've just been doing these like ice patrols outside of
Mhm.
her husband's school. And she's like, I'm walking around with people that I don't know. They speak like really great Spanish. I speak kind of really bad Spanish. We're trying to connect and communicate. And I'm feeling like just a sense of community. And of course, it's like, that threat, it's like more scary for some of us than others. And um, I see so many people who are like, in these moments of darkness and stress, we got to reach to each other.
That's right. That's right. That's collective impact right there. I keep on telling myself because it's what society tells me to do. It's like, oh, it's the new year. Let me reflect. Let me think on what I need to do. Let me create my list, right? The things that you're supposed to do. And so, as a leader yourself in this work, what are some things that's coming up for you as you came back from your vacation, you're logging back on, and you're thinking about running your company, building your team, and work with the communities ahead? What comes up for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, I'll just say, like, I think the idea that the new year, like, there's a should around resolutions, and like I I don't prescribe to, I don't think we have to do that. But I
Right.
am someone who like loves change, as we know, and the idea of like a new year, like a new thrust, that there is some momentum in newness, and it's like a moment to set intentions. I do believe, I do love that. I love to think about like vision boarding in January and setting intentions. And um yeah, when I think about everything that's happening, both kind of in the broader zeitgeist, um, and in our, like, here in America, in our federal climate, and under sort of, I'm sort of seeing, like, how there's kind of like a narrative around our values and our beliefs about who matters in our society.
Mm,
It the core to me that I wanna keep coming back to for myself and my team and the work that Be the Change does is the value of being in right relationship with ourselves and our people. And that there's like some beautiful, like, there's a simplicity in being connected, and a profound, I know that I have experienced over the years, like, profound dysregulation from being
mhm.
disconnected from people, from myself, from my communities, from my sense of purpose. I went through, some deep depression around that in the pandemic. I think a lot of us did, just
Sure.
being so disconnected. And now, like, everything that is bringing me any sense of hope is our moments of connection, especially when there's like not a lot of resources, or there even resources, even meaning a lot of hope or a lot of sense of safety. That yeah, how we stay connected to each other and how we bridge across difference. I think as we get scared,
Mm-hmm.
I like to hunker down, maybe isolate. That might be like just becoming by myself, or like finding the people who are most like me and kind of hunkering down with my like little pod. And I think there is a deep value right now in um in having enough sense of like love for myself that I have a little extra to extend to people who are more different than I am.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about this difference because it's kind of it is what this episode is rooted in today. So our episode today is called Why Affinity Group Work is a Leadership Competency. And so you talked a lot about bridges across difference. Now, I have heard in also my facilitation that a lot of people think that affinity groups actually amplify differences rather than bring people together. Why do you think affinity group work is so important?
Yeah.
And so that's the first question, and why do you think it's a leadership competency?
Mm. I think affinity groups can be a powerful tool, and they need to sort of be contextualized in I think across two dimensions. One dimension is your own racial identity. So
Mhm,
I think affinity groups for people who identify as you know in the dominant identity. So if we're talking about racial affinity groups, we're talking about white people. And if we're talking about so white people and then non-white people. And so affinity groups, if you're in a more dominant identity, can bring up a lot of it brings up different things than for folks who are in the non-dominant identity. And
mm,
there's like a complex range across both identities. Like so that's one dimension, right? It's like, are you dominant or non-dominant identity? And then the other thing, I think the other dimension is like how much work you've already done around like the political the personal consciousness, like a personal claiming of your own identity, right? So if I am a South Asian woman, I can think about my racial identity, right? My ethno-racial identity, like really micro. So I could say my I'm a Tamilian from if I talked to my dad and he wanted to describe where we're from, like he would speak to his language, to the village that he grew up in, and
mm,
who his father is, right? So like
beautiful.
lineage, for folks who come from for lots of people, there's like a sense of lineage as they define their racial
Yeah,
ethnic identity. And I think in today's culture, we're losing some of that. But I think a lot of our elders, that's like how they would speak, right, to where they're from. That becomes really micro, right? So if I try to say like I'm a Tamilian, um, which is the language that we speak, right? That gets me into like one little bubble. If I say, "Oh no, I'm South Indian," that expands my sense of who I would like my umbrella of who would fit under that identity with me. If I said, "Oh, I'm Indian," right? That expands
mm,
my umbrella even more. If I called myself a person of color, that expands
mm,
my umbrella even more. So there's like, where do I personally identify what feels like the strongest part of my identity? And where do I feel the most sense of connection, right? So I actually will say that the more like South Asian, Tamilian from the similar village, I actually get a little less comfortable because it gets
mm,
like I'm not used to an umbrella that's so small. I'm used to a
yeah,
bigger umbrella. Um, but I've done a lot of work. I've done a lot of work to know my culture, to know the history of where I come from, to study the religions. I've gone back to India. I have community in India. I have friends here who are Indian. I have friends here who are Indian people who've married non-Indian people, and then I have friends here who are like more multinational, multi-diverse, multiracial. And so my exposure, right, to like different communities around racial identity and being in conversation about like both personal identity and then the political and socialized implications of that identity. I've done a bunch of work around that. So how much work you've done really influences, I think, in when it comes to affinity groups. People who have had a lot of conversation, right? So if you studied um like women's studies in college, you've been exposed to a bunch of literature, different perspectives, you've read some bell hooks, right? So like if you
Yeah.
studied something, now two people who maybe are of different genders in that example, but they've come through a level of study together, they might have actually more in common to be able to talk about, gender and the role of
Mhm.
gender in the workplace than somebody who has done that work and somebody who hasn't done that work, but they're the same gender.
Sure, because the two people have pathways of connections in which they can share dialogue with, whereas the other two people probably one person has no access or pathway to even go and dialogue with that person.
Right. So there's shared experience, which creates a kind of affinity. There's shared
Yeah.
language and understanding, which is a different kind of affinity. So when we're talking about affinity groups in the workplace, um, sometimes it gets what I love about kind of holding those dimensions is we can think just separating people out based on racial identity.
Mhm.
If we're looking at it from a racial lens, you're going to get a bunch of drama and trauma in that
Yeah.
separation because many of us are accultured in cultures that are race neutral, right? So we're kind of
Mhm. Yeah.
sitting in a meeting and it never gets brought up that race is playing some role in the conversations that we're playing. So it's operating kind of below the waters. And so when you say we're going to create racial affinity groups, people are first of all like, why? Right? Why is this thing that we've been ignoring for years
Mhm.
and years and years? Suddenly we're gonna make it visible. And so we have to land up kind of like a why. And if we say, oh, the why is because we want to get to know ourselves better in order for us to um, in order for us to be able to have more connections across difference. That why, which I've heard some people say it like that,
Yeah.
it feels very personal, right? And so then it can feel like, why am I coming to work to reflect on my identity with other people who are reflecting on their identity? And like, how does that connect to my workplace?
Mhm.
Some of us does that sound familiar? Like
Yeah, totally.
that question? So I think for some people who are like, because my racial identity is playing a role in every meeting we're ever in, and
Mhm.
I would love to reflect on how it's impacting me, and I would love for you to understand how it's impacting me, and I would love for you to understand how it's impacting me without it costing me my emotional labor to have to explain it to you and describe it to you. So you do your work over there, I want to do my work over here because we need actually different things. So that could be like one perspective that is driving like the why for affinity groups.
Mhm.
Some people are desperate for it because they know that they're being impacted on a racial lens all the time. And so they want it. And then there's people who are like, but I don't understand why that I, I'm not having that same experience. So we need to actually create different whys for different um categories of people for the different segments of people, right? Um, I think the reason for affinity groups ultimately is for people to have a better sense of who they are and how they have been racialized, right? To bring some awareness for themselves, and then to practice having conversations across difference
Mhm.
within their same racial categorizations. Um, right. So that's step two. Because even in my own racial group, there are people who are very different, right? People who've been doing this work for a long time, people who are newly exposed to it, and people who, even if we've been doing it for a long time, are so that's like one dimension. There's another dimension of like there's a lot of diversity even within any affinity group you're going to create because no two
Yeah.
people, right? We're not monoliths. So
Right.
there's like we're reducing the level of difference so that we can still explore how there's differences in perspective, and we're practicing me telling my truth, listening to someone else's truth, expanding our sense of like, oh, there's many different perspectives that are out here. And then from that place of practice, step two, right, then we move to step three, which is starting to talk to people who are bridging, right, across different racial groups.
Mhm.
So from one racial group, we explore the diversity within that. Now we expand the level of complexity to in a multiracial conversation, right? We're exploring like, oh, how are our racial differences similar compared to what is similar in yours? And then where is there actually a nuance and difference even inside of individual experiences? That's step 3. And then step 4 is to say, okay, so now that we know all this and we see how we're impacting each other, how do we take this awareness and actually create organizational culture and policies and systems that allow us to thrive with the acknowledgement of this difference? So taking that all
Yeah.
that difference that was sort of like just kind of floating like gunk under the surface of the water, we're making it visible, we're pulling it up above the water, and now we're saying, how do we co-create a culture that is supportive of all of our dignities and acknowledges some of these differences? And some of those differences won't matter in the workplace, and some really do. And so like we get to become more nuanced about how are they impacting the work that now we put it in the context of our work, and we use it to design organizational practices. And so that's ultimately the purpose, right? Is to create a strong and resilient organizational culture that lets lots of people across difference stay together, be together, come together under a set of rules that were co-created. And that is where liberation is, right? That's the radical thing. Most of us have been taught like you have to figure out how to be okay in a system or a context where you didn't get to co-create the rules. And so for some of us, we feel more comfortable, and some of us are pretzeling a lot in order to fit in. And fitting in is
Mhm.
not the same as belonging.
Right.
So we're trying to get to step 4. But in order to get to that step 4, you have to go through steps 1, 2, and 3. And that work it can be messy and nuanced. And without understanding, I think there's like if we have like a framework, like, oh, there are many steps to get there. But ultimately we're going to step 4, which is that we want to have more comfort across difference, not less. But the way we get there is we we simplify the level of difference, and we build our competencies and our skills in acknowledging and talking across difference in order to get to that place of co-creation. Without that understanding, I think it can feel like we're doing therapy in the organization, or we're separating people out so we can attack the other groups and then have more, bias or anger towards a different group. I think it can make people in that dominant group feel very afraid, right? Feel like, oh,
Mm.
I'm now going to be attacked or judged for things that I didn't necessarily create. And now I'm not even aware of it. And I don't feel like I'm going to be like coached or taught. I'm just going to be attacked for what I don't know. And that can break a culture.
I really appreciate how clear you are with the 4 steps, and naming what the where you're going to, the North Star is that to visualize and be more um be okay with the difference and be in discomfort together and the co-creation. And then you share so many parts of yourself, and of course the work that you've done is so expansive. And the steps are very clear, and it sounds really, really challenging and really, really hard. So I'm just, saying these things. And when people say that we're going to work, it shouldn't feel like therapy, there's going to be a lot of folks there that have never had this space, who's held a lot of trauma. And so I imagine in step 1 and 2, I imagine if you get to step 3, then it takes quite a skilled facilitator to be able to hold that space in which they're not going to perpetuate harm. So I guess now we connect this to the leadership part of it, right? And so in your experience, you've run, I don't even know how many couple thousands affinity groups. So I think that this is where, if we can make that connection to that as a leader who's listening to this episode, going, yeah, I've tried that. Great. We have this. I did step 1, step 2, and it's really complex to hold those spaces. So
Yeah. I mean, I think, I'd love to, like, gently kinda hold that story of it's really complex and it's really hard because I actually don't think it's that hard. What I think
Mm,
it takes and you said this, right? What I think it takes is that we're building I think one of the most essential competencies that you build in doing this affinity work is sitting in discomfort,
mhm,
and to sit in the discomfort, right? And that discomfort might be, "I don't know what the right answer is. I don't know what's expected of me." Which for a leader can put a lot of stress, right? Like that perfectionism superhero dynamic that we have in our culture about leaders. Um, to shift that to, I don't know what's expected of me, to I have to figure out how to be authentic right now. Right?
mm,
Like, what's expected of me, who knows, right? What's expected of me is to tell my truth, is to actually tell my own story, and to not, try to tell the story that I think other people wanna hear, or not be looking
mhm,
for the one right
that's right.
answer in the story. So the competency, right? These are there's these process competencies of sitting in discomfort, of practicing telling my own truth versus telling the story I think other people wanna hear, of listening to someone who's having a very different experience and not critiquing it or judging it or evaluating it, but just saying, "Oh, that exists," right? These
Mhm,
we visibilize the differences that exist. Um, we will figure out what to do with it, right? We don't have to collapse it, right? The first step, so there's like another thing in, there's a kind of bias. What is it called? Action bias. That you're listening to challenges and you're immediately trying to jump to solve the problem, which I think is a thing that a lot of leaders that I coach, right, struggle with.
mhm,
Versus, oh, I'm listening to someone talk about something that was like really painful that they experienced. And instead of jumping to how do I solve it, um, I move to how must that person have felt, right? So I'm
mhm,
creating empathy, which might actually create more discomfort in me, right? That I actually can't do anything about this except hold like a compassionate stance for this other person. So these things that you practice in an affinity space, um, will make you a much more culturally competent leader. And
mm,
the idea of cultural competency, it's not actually knowing everything, right? It's not about like reading in a textbook, this is what
right.
Vietnamese people do and think and eat and their traditions and their holidays. Like that is a very that's like, sure, you can learn
Singular.
from,
That's super singular.
yeah, you're right, and we're never gonna know all of that stuff about all of the people, and there will be Vietnamese people who don't fit that model, right? And so that's actually not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is when we talk about cultural competency, it's knowing that people are different and knowing that I can't know everything about a person who's different than me, and that the weight that I can be a leader to that person is seeing them, is becoming curious and wanting to know, like, what is your experience here? How did that meeting hit you? How did that feedback hit you? How does that connect to how you like to receive praise? Oh, you actually can't hear praise because you grew up in a house that was very withholding on praise. And so when I kind of do this overly praiseful thing to you in a meeting, it's like it's not working. The thing that I think is
Mm,
happening is not happening. Right. So it um the thing that I wanna be able to understand about people is how do they wanna be communicated to? What motivates them? How do they learn? How do they grow? How do they develop? And that we can do in the absence of any understanding of culture or identity, but why? Why it becomes so much easier to manage,
mhm.
to lead, to inspire, to communicate if we're holding some of that, like, richness and texture of what makes the people on our teams, the people on our teams.
And but I also imagine that as that leader who's sitting in discomfort and is practicing and building that muscle, what's happening is there's a shift in the air in the culture where everybody else is experiencing it too. There's like a break, right? So it's not that that leader has to hold any performance or be transactional, but through their, like you said, authenticity, through their curiosity, through their truly wanting to understand their staff better, more folks are going to be able to lean into that a little bit and give one another more grace. I can only imagine that because it's again, it's the message that's being sent from the top down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're gonna test out, I think, a cool process this year
Mm,
in our public training series. So for listeners that are out there, I like you said, we work with organizations that are like, oh, I kind of I see I've heard that affinity groups is a thing.
mhm.
And it's a form of employee resource groups, right, which have existed forever in organizational, like in the world of organizational interventions, like ways to build culture. So people who often want to start a racial affinity group, and as you said, even though I'm like challenging like that it's not that hard, or challenging the story, right, that it's hard,
Yeah.
it can be you are watching people go through a lot of their own
I
processes.
mean, girl, it still sounds hard as you're
It's
saying
hard.
it. However, so let me just say,
It's
it's
hard.
still it is hard, and it when you named what is needed by the individual to slow down and pause and to understand that you want to open yourself up to learning more about others, like that is actually not hard. And then the active listening, the curiosity, holding cultural competencies and being open. Now, you created small little blueprints of what is needed. And now that we can visualize what to do, we can use that blueprint, but it's still hard because you actually have to do it, right? So that's the thing is like
Yeah.
the way that you're speaking of it is like, yes, that makes complete sense. Or for some people that they might be listening and they say, oh, I didn't know that. Maybe I was already doing some steps, or actually I didn't know what the next step was to do. But now actually moving forward and doing each one of those steps and holding those space, it is going to be hard because you're putting yourself out there.
Yeah. Yeah, you're putting yourself out there. So and that, right? So like having to do all of that work that you just described in front of people you supervise, or in front of your colleagues, or in front of somebody that like, oh, I'm in this training space and we're doing this affinity group, and then in an hour we're going to go into a budget meeting, or we're going to have to like have a very different kind of conversation. It we are mixing up some of the things that feel like usual about workplaces when we're trying to elevate workplace culture with these additional kind of layers of humanity. So we're going to offer in our public training series affinity groups, and we're still playing with the design, but tell me what you think, and if there
Mm.
are folks out there who are listening to this and have ideas, let us know what you think too. We're There are going to be spaces for folks from lots of different organizations to join a virtual space, and we just did some calculation last year, like we have people coming to these virtual trainings across many countries and
Yeah.
across time zones, and like somebody joined from at like 3 a.m. to one of our trainings a couple of weeks ago, that I was just like, first of all, so flattered, and then like horrified, like um, so anyway, just to know, like they're diverse and they're in many ways, right? Internationally diverse. And I think for some people who are working in an organization that doesn't have a ton of diversity, it can feel very isolating to say, I want to be in an affinity group space, but I'm the only Black person who works here. Or there's two Black people who
Mm.
work here and we don't actually get along because we've been
Yeah.
pitted against each other so often, and people are confusing our names, or whatever, right? We just don't like each other. So um, we're going to hold these spaces, these trainings where people can join from lots of different organizations, and hopefully we'll have, you know, representation across many different racial groups.
Yeah.
And so in that space, we're going to both do this combined practice of talking about why affinity groups and that meta learning, and kind of breaking down like what is the competency you practice in this first affinity group space, right? It's just
Mm.
noticing what are the stories that I've held true about myself, and how do I feel about hearing stories from people who are the same racial affinity as me that is different than me, or like what did it feel like to even identify as white, or identify as Indian, right? Versus South Asian, right? There's a bunch of choices that people make. And that identification step, if you're multiracial, it brings up a ton of things. Why do I have to choose? And I'm not just
Mm.
one thing. And or you're light skinned and you're like, I identify as Black, but I'm going to go into this group and I'm worried that other people are not going to see me as Black or Black enough, right? So all these things that come up for folks, that might be just day one is the first competency. So we get to break down. We start in a diverse room. We'll talk about one competency, and then we'll practice it as we divide out. We'll have facilitators or we'll have kind of facilitated processes for small group affinity spaces that will be self-facilitated, which I also think is really important because while the work is hard, there is like the practice of kind of group facilitation where there isn't necessarily a leader who has done this for 1,000 years. Most organizations are not going to have that. And so like that's another thing to practice, right? That self facilitation in a small container, 15 minutes, 20 minutes of a conversation where you're talking about a specific topic and practicing one competency. And then we'll come back together and debrief from different racial perspectives. How was it for the Asian folks? How was it for people who identified as Chicana? Right. So we can see what level of micro affinity we'll be able to create based on who's in the room. And I think what it's going to give folks is like a little bit more of a braiding than what people can do in their own organizations. So we can start multicultural, we move into affinity, we practice kind of like getting into affinity in a multiracial space, which brings up a lot for folks. We practice one competency using a very directed prompt and a structured process we'll give folks. And then we get to come back together and hear what different groups' experiences were. And I think over time, right, people who come to that space, I think we're going to do it 4 times over the course of the year. But as folks come repeatedly, I think you get to build a practice and a comfort before trying to do this at home. That whole like, try this at home. Like we want people to try it at home, but with some familiarity, especially if you're somebody in leadership where I think it doesn't feel as safe to do your work in front of your staff. I never felt fully comfortable showing all of my growing edges in front of my staff, nor do I think they want to hold that space for me.
Yeah, that's right.
I think being able to learn with a little bit of anonymity can take some of the temperature down in the learning process.
Yeah, we'll drop all that information about the public training series in the show notes. And I'll say that for myself, that this skill that we've practiced internally to be more race forward has really supported my identity and role as a facilitator too.
Yeah.
So yeah, for sure. If you think about it, going into these spaces and understanding where you hold dominant identities, in any given space as you're learning about X topic and understanding what is needed to invite the participants to co-create the space. Because how are you as one person, as the facilitator, build a brave and safe space? You know how people often say that I'm going to build a brave and safe space. And you're one person with this diverse group of folks too. So I also want to put a plug in there to say that yes, leaders, anybody, and facilitators, these sessions are really, really, really valuable. And so we're excited. This is our first episode of the year. We're hoping to do, I don't know, 24, 36, 48. Shoot, I don't know what the next sequence is, but a whole lot more. And so we would love to hear your comments. Thank you so much for listening and supporting us. We are so grateful, and we want to continue to share the work that we do at Be the Change and Be Liberated AF. Thanks, y'all.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
We hope this conversation provided helpful insight and inspired you to create a more inclusive and liberated workplace. If you enjoyed today's discussion, please subscribe, leave a review, and share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. Your support makes a huge difference in helping us reach more listeners like you. We love to hear your thoughts on today's topic. Connect with us on social media and drop a comment. You can find all the links in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.